More, let's bring in our political panel, Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, and Mara Gillespie of BlueStack Strategies. Jeannie, just to begin with you, as we await the president's read, or at least what he will say about his meeting with Xi Jinping that happened today, how does he need to straddle the line to make it seem like he has a foreign policy win here, but also not do anything to make angry the many China hawks he has to deal with at home?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult for him to quiet the criticism. After all, we're going into an election year. We've already heard people like Nikki Haley say that he was practically begging for this meeting. So I think he realizes that criticism is to be expected. I think what he's got to do is be honest about the very modest but critically important issues at stake here. And I think he has something very important going for him. As we've been watching the Chinese state media, they have been very, very positive about this meeting, which I think supports what the president has been saying and what most Chinese scholars have been arguing, people who study China rather, is that this is a competitive relationship, one of the most competitive historically ever, but neither nation can survive without the other, regardless of who is president. And that is why this meeting and these talks and opening up communication, especially military to military, is so critically valuable. So just the meeting itself in that perspective is a real win for the administration and, quite frankly, for China and Xi Jinping.
How does that hit you, Maura, knowing that hating on China has been one of the most popular bipartisan activities that we have in Washington? What's the chairman of the China Select Committee going to say tomorrow after he sees Joe Biden stand alone in that news conference tonight?
They're going to hit on a lot of things, especially not just the economy aspect, which we saw during the pandemic, our reliance on China and the way they were manipulating that. And so you saw a lot of legislation. My former boss introduced legislation to make things here at home or in our hemisphere because of our supply chain vulnerabilities we saw during the pandemic. So coupling that with the human rights aspect of things and the foreign policy problems with China, looking at Taiwan, and also their backing of Russia and their partnerships and their friendships with Iran and Russia, that can't be overlooked. So the Republicans are going to hit on those issues when it comes to President Biden's, meeting today.
Yeah, as we've seen at pretty much each and every Republican primary debate, the issue of China looms very large in terms of foreign policy issues. But, Jeannie, it raises the question always of how much the American voter really considers foreign policy when they're heading to the polls. Yes, this is an opportunity for an incumbent president to look very presidential as he meets with a foreign leader. It's incredibly high profile, but how does it actually resonate with those who are deciding if they want him to have a second term when they go to the ballot box?
Yeah, historically, voters won't take foreign policy into account much at all. We see the polls and we see that as you compare it to something that they do take into account, like the economy, for instance, or safety, security, and crime, it is usually far down the list. That, of course, changes if we have boots on the ground, which we don't. That said, of course, our relationship with China is critical to many things that voters care about. And the number one issue they care about is the economy. We depend on our relationship with China in order to ensure that we have a healthy economy. So that is something that people may take into account in that respect. But directly, it won't matter as much as like the economy or something else. So the Biden team knows that, but they also know that this is critically important to what the president promised to do when he was running last time, and he is intent on keeping that promise.
Well, as we consider what's important to voters right now, we're wondering if they might have a longer menu to choose from, as we heard today from the senator, at least for now. From West Virginia, Joe Manchin asked on NBC about whether he is in fact considering a run, likely a third-party run for president. Here's what he said.
Are you considering running for president?
I will do anything I can to help my country.
Is that a yes?
And you're saying, does that mean you would consider it? Absolutely. Every American should consider. If they're in a position to help save the country, I think we're on the wrong course. So I will do everything possible.
Maura, I don't know if we're reading too far into those comments. He didn't say he's running, but people certainly are listening to anything that Joe Manchin says right now, now that he's said he's not running for re-election to the Senate. If he decides to do that, does that mean a re-election of Donald Trump?
Very likely. I mean, it's going to hurt the Democrats. It's going to hurt Joe Biden because largely those votes that he would have normally got. Because whether people are super enthusiastic about Joe Biden, I don't think they are, but it's what's the alternative? And so they will tend to vote for Joe Biden because the alternative is Donald Trump. And with Joe Manchin in the field, that creates another opportunity for them. And I don't think it'll pull enough Republicans to vote Democrat.
Yeah, it does, Maura, seem like it is going to be Donald Trump. He's the presumptive Republican nominee at this point. But we also are looking at some polling that shows Nikki Haley is gaining strength in New Hampshire, which, by the way, announced the date of its primary today, January 23rd, about a week after the Iowa caucuses. But this Emerson poll that came out today shows Trump at 49, Nikki Haley up 14 points to 18%. In fourth is Governor Ron DeSantis at 7%. And I just wonder, what's the most significant part of that? The fact that Nikki Haley is ascendant, or the fact that even with that gain, she still remains more than 30 points behind the former president?
I think the momentum is a positive sign of the party. And New Hampshire is interesting as well because they're a little bit more moderate. They're not looking at, you're not seeing a whole big MAGA wing there. They're largely in polls from last month or 2 months ago now had said they would choose anyone but Donald Trump. So Kristen Newt had talked about it in an op-ed in New York Times, op-ed he did 2 months ago. But I think that's an interesting part of it. Nikki Haley did really well. She's done really well during the debates. And she's presented herself as someone who has a strong handle on the issues, especially when it comes to foreign policy. And people seem to be responding to that. Again, it's going to be tough to topple Trump in the polls. But I remain hopeful because I can't really imagine a country that has 330 million plus people and 2 senior citizens are our best and brightest and deserve to be in the White House. Absolutely not. These can't possibly be the best that we have to offer.
What does this mean for Ron DeSantis? So we live to fight another day here, Maura, but it looks like everyone is just planning to shut it down at the beginning of next year. When you consider the number of Republicans who voted against the CR yesterday, what does that tell you about a vote on a real budget?
Mike Johnson's going to have to work across the aisle to get this done again. Probably not to those extreme numbers, but he's going to have to be reasonable. And that's not really something that we're seeing right now with the Republican conference, an appetite to be reasonable, unfortunately. So January 19th is going to be not much time, really, when you think about how much time we have left in the session to then prepare for a January 19th deadline. And again, you have this brand new speaker who has not been in this position or any kind of true leadership position to do this.
And he's in this position because the last speaker was ousted because he passed a clean CR with Democratic support, which is exactly what Mike Johnson just did. It seems like Republicans are saying we're going to give him a little bit more grace here, but I just wonder how far that extends. Do you think he's going to be able to make it all the way through 2024 when a spending fight has to happen right at the beginning of it?
I don't know how tired members of Congress are about the whole speaker fight. Again, they've been talking about having worked for 10 weeks, which to the American people is probably going to sound pretty lame, as that they're so tired after 10 weeks of work. But I do think that he's going to have to prepare himself for what comes in January because especially when it comes to our foreign policy and our foreign aid, those are non-negotiables for some members, and especially members of the Republican Party as well, who feel really strongly about making sure we support our allies. So there are going to be a lot of divides there that he's going to have to figure out how to step over and kind of come to an agreement on.
To what extent can the White House lead on this, Jeannie, or is this really a matter for Congress to deal with at this point? The supplemental request has already been made. Should it be rewritten, reframed somehow by the administration?
It has been made. The reality is that nothing has changed. And far be it for me to accuse the new speaker of being Pollyannish, but I'm listening to him talk in that clip you just played. What is he talking about? He's saying something has changed. So in the next 21 legislative days before this CR runs out, they are magically going to have what? The power to force this through, to force these draconian cuts they want through. It's not going to happen. And he couples that yesterday with promising no more CRs unless he has another, 50 Republicans in his pocket that are going to vote, which he does not. This thing is going to go down the way it has to. Maura is right. It's going to be, and it has to be.
All right, Jeannie Sheehan Zaino and Maura Gillespie, thank you both so much for joining us this evening. And